In this video, I'm going to show you my #1 tip for making circular saw cuts a breeze. And in the process, I'm actually going to wind up showing you the 3 best tips that I have. And these tips are all actually homemade circular saw upgrades. Just quick jigs and accessories that you can knock together to make every rip and long cut 10 times easier. But I'm also going to show you a material hack that can be applied to dozens of situations in the shop and is probably the single most helpful upgrade you could ever make on your tools and jigs. That's all coming up next. But while you're here, also be sure to get your free copy of our interactive ebook, The Ultimate Carpentry Checklist. This free guide offers visual explanations for every important topic in carpentry, from tools and lumber to joinery and concepts. If you don't know a term on the list, just click on it and the guide will take you straight to an explanation in the Visual Glossary. Every carpenter and DIYer can gain a lot from this guide. So click the link down below in the description or comments, or visit us at thehonestcarpenter.com to find out more. All right, with that said, let's get on with the video. So the big problem with the circular saw is that it doesn't have the built-in fences that the table saw and miter saw have. Those tools keep materials stable while you're working on them, and this helps you keep your cuts straight and clean. But circular saws are freehand, so perfectly straight, clean cuts are difficult to achieve. Normally to get them, you have to rig a system of clamps and guides that are bulky, tedious, and time-consuming to lay out. But to get around that process, we can build simple jigs and accessories. I feel like most people have seen some version of the homemade track saw, which is just a fabricated panel guide that can be whipped up in minutes. We used to knock these together on job sites out of scrap lumber. And these panel guides are great. They accomplish virtually the same thing that track saws do, but they don't come with the insanely high price tags that track saws have. And as far as I'm concerned, they are drastically better than the weird, bulky rip guides that imitate the track saw. But the one problem with these homemade panel guides is that they still often need clamps and stops to hold them in place, and setting those systems up can be tricky and tedious. They don't always fit onto your cut table, and you may have to modify your work setup just to get them in place. But the good news is you can solve all these problems by making one simple material upgrade to your panel guide. And it all comes down to this stuff: adhesive silicone pads. This flexible roll is actually a form of grip tape. It's cheap, abundant, and incredibly easy to install. And once you see how effective it is, you'll find ways to use it everywhere in the shop. So let me show you how to use this silicone grip tape to produce a homemade track saw. And I'll show you a bunch of other tricks and circular saw upgrades along the way. Our primary material here is 1/2-inch plywood. I'm using sand apply from Home Depot, which is relatively cheap with a decent veneer surface. We're going to create our simple panel guide from just a small portion of this 5-foot cutoff section. But the key to making this whole guide system work is that we need to produce one extremely accurate rip, which is specifically for this narrow top piece. Normally you could do this very easily on the table saw. But not everybody has a table saw, and frankly, for this application, you don't need one. Ironically, the guide we're about to make would also let you produce that straight rip in seconds, but we don't have it yet. So we have to turn to our other helpful accessory, the rip fence. This angled bar comes with most circular saws. It slots into the sole plate and, once it's tightened into place, provides a 90-degree face that helps keep the saw blade at a set distance from the edge of the material. Some people love rip fences, some people hate them. Personally, I love them. But I can understand how some people feel like they don't provide enough stability when ripping because they're sort of small and don't always make it easy to get a good alignment. So, let me show you a 2-minute rip fence upgrade that really helps address all of these problems. You're just going to need some nice flat 3/4-inch material. I'm using pre-primed pine. And we'll need to produce a small piece that is roughly the width of the rip fence guide. You can use the guide to scribe its width onto the face of your material. Then, you just need to rip out a short stick that is this width. The great thing is this cut you're producing does not have to be extremely clean. I actually just scribed and ripped mine by hand, then cross-cut it to about 7 or 8 inches in length. That's it, just a couple rough cuts. Then I screwed this skinny block to the face of my rip fence. I'm using something like 3/4-inch wood screws that were just laying around. You can buy small packs of screws in this size. And most rip fences come with pre-drilled holes in them for this purpose. If yours didn't, you can always drill your own holes with something like titanium-coated twist bits. My pilot hole isn't very well centered, but I was just showing you how that works. But to make the attachment, I just pin my fence to my block of wood and align it so it's centered along the length of the piece. And I make sure that the block doesn't encroach on the gap created by the angled neck. You want to leave that open. I mark my hole locations and pre-drill them, then I drive screws in those holes carefully. What I'm left with is a clean little extension of the rip fence face. When this is slotted into the sole plate, this extension gives my fence a longer bearing, and it even adds a little more reach towards the blade so I can rip narrower widths on the wide side of the saw. This upgrade makes it vastly easier and more stable to cut material with the rip fence. And as I said, that's very necessary because we now need to use it to get a really straight strip from our plywood. To make this cut perfectly straight, we're going to need to rely on the factory edge. Ply sheets come from the factory with clean, straight edges that are square to one another, and carpenters rely heavily on these straight edges to help us create accurate cuts. And despite the fact that I've cut this sheet before, I know that this edge is a factory edge because of the printed words on it, so I can trust it to be very straight. I want to produce a long strip from this edge that is about 3 inches wide. So I load my rip fence on the wide side of the saw and bring it in as far as it will go. Then I lock the fence into place. Now, by just pressing the inner face of the rip fence to the edge of the ply sheet, I can fire up the saw and use the wooden extension to follow the factory edge of our sheet. The stability I gain from this attached block makes this cut a breeze. Also, before I made this cut, I used a straight edge and pencil to mark a plot line for reference. This is just so I can be sure that our blade is tracking straight and is on target, which it is. When I get to the end, I'm careful to guide the saw perfectly straight through the exit, and like that, I have our 3-inch strip. You can even test the straightness by checking it against a metal straight edge. This cut may be off by about 1/32 of an inch in 5 feet, but I'm not worried about that. That's well below the threshold for tolerance and smaller than the eye can pick up, so it's all good. So we now have our narrow top piece. Now we need to produce the base layer for our panel guide. And this is actually really easy because the cut quality just doesn't matter here as much. To start out, I just want a piece that is about 10.5 inches wide. So I mark 10.5 inches on both ends of my ply sheet and connect the marks with the straight strip we just cut. It's already coming in handy. Then I just make this second cut by hand. Again, this doesn't have to be very straight, so I'm not stressing it. Also, notice that I have my prop blocks down and I'm just cutting through them about 1/4 of an inch. That's normal and makes long rips like this easier, as we'll discuss more in a moment. But soon I have that cut made, and now I can attach our two pieces together. Notice that this board did have a pretty pronounced bow in it. It just sort of came to me that way, and that's fine. We can work the bows of both pieces against one another, so they sort of counteract each other. I position the narrow strip on the wider strip, so it's about 2 inches from one side and about 5 to 6 inches from the other side. I trace this location with the pencil and then move the narrow piece out of the way. Then I squeeze glue liberally inside these scribe lines. I stay about 1/2 inch away from the edges and ends so I don't get too much squeeze out. But I do use a block to spread this glue down a bit and add more in any place I feel like the coat is too thin. With the glue in place, I position the piece right in the path that I marked for it and I shoot it on with 3/4 inch brad nails. If you don't have a brad nailer, you can once again just use something like 3/4 inch screws, or you could just weight this piece with bricks or something heavy and leave it for a while. We just need it to adhere tightly, and brad nails are the fastest way to do that. Now the strip is on and very secure, and we're actually almost done. We just need to make our first official rip cuts. I start with the wide side of the sole plate. I place it on the lower panel, and I press the edge of the sole plate very tight to the edge of the center strip. Firing up the saw, I cut slowly and carefully, using the straight center strip as a guide. When I finish the cut on that side, I just bring the saw over and do the same thing with the cut on the narrow side of the sole plate. Once again, I go slowly and make extra sure that my sole plate is snug to the edge of the center strip. When that cut's done, I have a clean, straight guide with two sides that perfectly represent the blade standoff created by the width of the sole plate. This is exactly what we need to make quick, hassle-free cuts with the circular saw, as I'll show in a moment. But there's still one problem. The guide may still have this tendency to slide around. Wood can actually be quite slick, and the guide may want to slide across the surface of a board we're cutting. It can't be trusted to stay in place without a clamp, and as I said, that's tedious to set up. So here's where our number one tip comes in. It's time to apply our silicone grip tape. A lot of companies manufacture this stuff, but this is a 3M product that comes in about 40-inch lengths and 5-inch widths, currently for about $10 a roll. This tape is so easy to install. You just peel off the paper backer and start laying it into place. I keep my tape about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch away from the edges and ends. Peeling the backer in sections, I just press it down firmly, smoothing those sections out with my hands. When it's fully in place, I pull the cellophane layer on the other side, and like that, we have our shiny silicone surface exposed. Now I just start filling in the remaining sections. I cut a piece that fits the lower part of that side, and then I actually split another roll in half to get a narrower width for the remaining side. I don't feel the need to fill in every available space on the bottom face. There's plenty of grip surface between all these pieces, so I leave about an inch gap between the two strips. Now, when I flip the guide over and lay it down, it practically just gets stuck to the table. It's so grippy. I can exert a lot of pressure on it in nearly any direction, and it doesn't budge. I'm literally pushing my table around with the friction. If I'm determined to move it, I can get it to slide a little. Otherwise, it just stays right where I dropped it. Even with this tiny bit of upward warp at the end, the guide is still incredibly stable, and saw weight is going to press out most inconsistencies. And keep in mind, the tape is kind of sticky and will pick up sawdust and debris, but it can be clean, which I'll show you how to do in a minute, and a bit of grit and dust still doesn't really affect it. It still holds really well with a little sawdust on it. This tape worked so effectively that before I cut, I even decided to upgrade my prop blocks. Prop blocks are very prone to sliding around, and you can knock them out of place easily, especially if they're a little bowed. So I just cut some narrow strips from my remaining tape roll and applied them to the backs of my blocks. I put them on the concave faces because these are the more stable faces when they're laying down. Now, with the grip tape applied, these blocks don't want to go anywhere. This is a permanent upgrade, and it took about 3 minutes to install. Now I'm finally ready to try out a test cut. I just throw a piece of 3/4 inch ply on my prop blocks and mark my cut point with 2 crow's feet. I use a straight edge to make a plot line just for reference so we can be sure the saw guide isn't moving. Then, I lay the guide down so the edge on the narrow side splits the plot line right up the center. It's perfectly placed on that line. Keep in mind, I still want to be aware of where the kerf will fall. That is, which side of the line I want the blade to cut on. I want the kerf to the left of the line, where these X's are. And with the edge of the guide right on the cut line, that's exactly where the blade will pass. One thing you do want to be sure of though is that you're setting your depth correctly. The 1/2 inch thickness of the guide means you have to add 1/2 inch of depth to your cut. So for this 3/4 inch board, I actually set my depth at about 1.5 inches. With that resolved, I carefully lift the blade guard, a technique I've talked about how to do safely in other videos, and then place the narrow edge of the sole plate on the guide. The blade teeth will literally hug the edge of the guide. That's what we want. And to keep it that way, I'll focus all my attention on keeping the sole plate pressed against the center strip and keeping the saw flat and stable. On this skinnier side, you don't want the weight of the saw to make it tip out, like this. With a little concentration though, it's easy to keep it flat and on track. When I finish the cut, the waste piece falls away cleanly, and what I find is that I was dead accurate on my cut line. I split the pencil line straight up the center and didn't waver or encroach on the good side at all. The silicone tape kept everything perfectly still. That's it, our first perfect rip on the narrow side of the guide. It was done in seconds. And cutting on the other side of the guide is really just as easy. To prove that, I laid out a diagonal cut with 2 perimeter marks and dropped my guide into place to connect them. Once again, I scribed a plot line just for reference. Then I raised my blade guard and set the wide side of the sole plate on the guide, and once again focused on keeping the plate tight to the center strip. I made the cut in an identical fashion, and again, I get a perfectly straight, clean cut in seconds. The finished piece shows that I was right on my cut line with no deviation. When using this side of the guide, you just want to be really sure before cutting that the edge of your guide is exactly where you want it, because you may not be able to watch the cut form if you're reaching over the guide. That's fine though, because when the guide sticks in place this well, you can really trust it to not move. And just look at the finished results. These are basically table saw grade cuts, or track saw grade cuts. Except you didn't need to buy a track saw for hundreds of dollars, or use some gimmicky guide that you have to latch onto your saw every time. The panel guide can sit somewhere convenient in your shop and be ready for use in seconds whenever you need it. And you can make several of them for different cut lengths. I think it'd be good to have an 8-foot guide for full sheet rips, then something like a 52-inch guide for 4-foot cuts, and probably a 28-inch guide for 2-foot cuts. I've got a fresh sheet of 1/2 inch plywood, and I'll probably whip up a few more of these once I get some more grip tape. As I said, I think once you look around your shop, you'll find plenty of places to apply this tip. For instance, you might mount your miter saw to a small set of blocks and put silicone tape on the underside of the blocks to keep it from sliding around. The tape can be cleaned with a bit of Windex and a rag, and it comes out like new. Or if you're worried about Windex staining your wood, you can really just use water and a rag. It's so low maintenance. Making these guides is so easy, you can knock out the whole process in about 10 minutes. And it only costs maybe $25 to $30 with the grip tape thrown in, and you've got plenty of plywood left over to build other projects. So, I hope that was helpful. And if you want even more great free advice, be sure to check out our Ultimate Carpentry Checklist. It really is the ultimate free resource for new carpenters, journeyman carpenters, experienced DIYers, and everyone in between. You can get it right now down in the description and comments below. As always, thanks for watching. I'm Ethan James with TheHonestCarpenter.com. I'll see you next time.